Sometimes my mind drifts backward to that upper corridor, not to dwell on the past, but to truly comprehend what I heard. When my stepsister's wedding took place, I was only 14, and the residence still retained the warmth generated by 300 guests and half a day of continuous choral singing, while the scent of prepared poultry seemed deeply embedded in the draperies. Resting in the bed that had belonged to her just 24 hours prior, where the bedding still seemed to hold the tense metallic trace of her anxiety, I listened to her weeping on the other side of the partition. Her tears did not stem from mere exhaustion. They came from someone who had suddenly discovered an aspect of existence for which she had been given absolutely no preparation. More than a decade passed before the true nature of that auditory memory finally became clear to me. Though I might still lack a complete understanding of every detail, the clarity I do possess is substantial enough that I feel compelled to share the progression of this discovery. Up to this point, 5 distinct indicators have emerged: the weeping, the quiet grieving, the pervasive lack of communication, the reality of my own physical form, and a tiny measurement of time that seems far too brief to carry any weight. For a long time, I compartmentalized this as an isolated incident involving a single young woman on an autumn evening. That assumption was incorrect, and before expanding on how deeply flawed that perspective was, it is important to ground this exploration in the reality of an Amish soul and the world I grew up within. For those who have been tracing these insights alongside me and wish to discover where this path concludes, joining this ongoing conversation is a way to ensure these narratives continue to be voiced. If you want to help sustain the effort of articulating these hidden histories, the means to offer that support are available. Before proceeding, I would ask you to consider whether you have ever been haunted by a sound whose meaning you could not quite decipher. Let me now unfold the deeper realities that completely recontextualized everything for me. The marriage ceremony between my stepsister and her groom occurred on a specific autumn Thursday in November, a choice of day that was strictly bound by established customs, ensuring that every element of the occasion adhered to tradition. The gathering commenced at 9 o'clock in the morning, right inside our main living space, utilizing seating units transported from the communal church wagon that were arranged in straight rows where our family furniture normally rested. The service consisted of 3 hours conducted entirely in German, featuring traditional hymns from the Ausbund that were executed at such a deliberate, drawn-out pace that each stanza seemed to stretch endlessly. Positioned on the section reserved for female attendees, with my head covering freshly prepared, I observed my stepsister's facial expression. At 20 years old, her countenance gave the impression of someone frantically trying to commit a lesson to memory without having been permitted the time to read the text. Lacking the maturity to comprehend that gaze at the time, I simply attributed it to standard premarital jitters, making it the very first piece of unrecognized information I internalized. The subsequent realization arrived half a day later, long after the ceremony and the celebratory dinner held at the Eck, which is the specifically arranged corner table where newlyweds sit amidst decorations of celery and glass vessels to symbolize fertility, though the underlying meaning of that symbolism was never articulated to me. Once the evening melodies concluded, the horse-drawn carriages departed into the nighttime, and the profound stillness settled over the homestead that only happens when hundreds of individuals leave a space simultaneously. The new couple retired upstairs. This arrangement was equally dictated by custom, as newlyweds traditionally spend their initial night beneath the roof of the bride's family, with the expectation of rising at 4 in the morning to assist with the subsequent tidying. Tucked into the adjoining bedroom, which had been my stepsister's personal space until that very morning, the mattress beneath me carried the scent of crisp fabric treatment and the subtle aroma of the dried flora she preserved in her storage chest. As the structural elements of the dwelling began to cool and settle, the sound reached me through the wooden wall planks. It was not a loud lamentation, but something far more painful to hear: the constrained, deliberate stifling of a person attempting to compress her weeping until it became completely imperceptible. I did not move to comfort her, nor did I approach her door, an admission I must state with complete transparency. At 14, I remained motionless in my bed, absorbing the sound but taking no action because the concept of intervening never occurred to me. My adolescent mind assumed the reaction was merely the emotional toll of an exhausting day, believing that all brides wept as a natural consequence of transitioning from one phase of existence to another, even if she had not yet physically departed from her childhood home. When daylight returned, I looked for signs of emotional disruption, the way one surveys the landscape after a severe weather event, to see what has been altered. The culinary space was already bustling when I made my appearance, with the cast iron stove operational, the water vessel heating, and footwear moving across the timber floors. My stepsister was already positioned at the counter, preparing slices of bread for the individuals assisting with the cleanup. Her physical movements appeared unchanged, her head covering was perfectly aligned, and she offered pleasantries when questioned about the nuptials, yet she refrained from sitting down. I took note of her remaining on her feet throughout the entire morning, and whenever I moved close enough to catch her gaze, her eyes seemed focused on something just beyond me. It was not a vacant stare through my person, but rather an intentional look past me, mirroring the way an individual avoids a reflective surface when they are unready to confront their own image. She distributed coffee, provided responses to inquiries, and navigated the domestic environment with the precision of a theatrical performer enacting a sequence she had fully internalized beforehand. That level of self-control was absolute, and I now recognized that this very stoicism was the clearest indicator of all. Over the course of a single evening, she had absorbed the realization that this internal burden was to be managed entirely in isolation, the cultural framework having successfully imparted its foundational doctrine. Seeking clarity, I pursued the only available avenue of inquiry later that day, once the carriages had reappeared to retrieve the communal benches, and the newlyweds had journeyed toward his family's agricultural property. Standing in the culinary area alongside my stepmother, who was the mother of the bride, I initiated a basic conversation. The exact phrasing escapes me now, given my youth and lack of conversational sophistication at 14, but it amounted to mentioning that I had detected her daughter's weeping the night before, or perhaps asking after her well-being. I have repeatedly visualized that specific interaction in an attempt to recover the precise wording, yet the verbal details remain elusive. What remains vivid is my stepmother's physical reaction. She was in the process of wiping a large platter, the sort reserved exclusively for marital unions and passings, and her movements suddenly ceased. The action was not theatrical, just a temporary suspension of movement where the drying cloth sat motionless against the pottery. She directed her gaze toward me, her lips parted slightly, and I detected a fleeting emotion behind her expression that I would not possess the vocabulary to identify until a decade later. Her lips then compressed, and she remarked that everything was fine, and that it simply represented a significant life transition, before returning to her task with the subsequent plate. The inquiry concluded right there, leaving me at a complete standstill with the one individual who should have possessed the insight, having encountered an entryway that opened a mere fraction before snapping shut. With the perspective of time, I understand that my stepmother's absence of explanation was not born of malice, but was rather a piece of cultural transmission. Her own maternal figure had offered her the exact same absence of information, allowing the quietude to perpetuate itself by utilizing the very women who had endured its consequences. This dead end forced my internal investigation to shift toward an unanticipated territory, my own experience. I began to review my own personal realities, though I did not view them through an analytical lens at the time. By the age of 14, my comprehension of my own physical form was limited to a specific catalog of restrictions. I understood the directives regarding apparel, which dictated hemlines reaching the lower leg and sleeves extending to the wrists. I accustomed myself to altering my garments in total darkness, or while oriented toward the wall, even when completely alone, because maintaining a modest appearance was not an exhibition for the public, but rather an internal spiritual requirement. Prior to that time, I had never viewed my unclothed form in a mirror, a reality that persisted not due to an absence of reflective surfaces, but because the act of looking felt like an unnameable violation of propriety. I was taught that physical intimacy was transgressive long before I possessed any comprehension of what that intimacy actually entailed, receiving the restriction without ever being provided the context. The terminology of pregnancy was familiar to me, yet my understanding of it resembled my understanding of severe weather phenomena, an occurrence that affected individuals due to elemental forces completely hidden from my view. I failed to connect the concept to my own anatomy, which existed as a reality I was completely unequipped to interpret at 14. Today, I recognize that this lack of comprehension was not an omission in my upbringing. It was the core objective of the upbringing itself, intentionally designed to ensure I would be unable to decode the auditory evidence coming through that partition. There is one additional element of this reality that must be examined before this retrospective transitions from personal recollection into a broader cultural analysis. I spent a considerable amount of time attempting to reconstruct the exact nature of the guidance my stepsister received prior to her nuptial night. Through fragmented conversations, remarks she made in subsequent years, and insights gained after my own departure from that environment, the reality became clear. Her mother addressed the topic with her exactly once, occurring on the morning of the marriage ceremony in the brief interval between the initial vocal rehearsal and the arrival of the wedding carriages. The duration of that entire interaction lasted a mere 3 minutes, a figure verified when discussing it years later, during which her mother articulated a single sentence regarding the events of the upcoming night. While my stepsister declined to disclose the precise vocabulary, she confirmed that the utterance relied entirely on the concept of a spouse and the concept of compliance. Two specific ideas contained within one solitary sentence delivered during a 3-minute window constituted her entire preparation. That was the entirety of the resources granted to her to navigate the most defenseless encounter of her existence up to that point. Reflecting on that metric now, the disproportion is striking. 3 minutes of instruction tasked with countering an entire lifetime of unvoiced reality, and the unvoiced reality emerged victorious. The final component of this personal recollection involves the literal setting of that initial night, an arrangement that must be viewed with absolute clarity. Custom dictates that the new couple returns directly to the home of the bride's parents, meaning that the most intimate, unfamiliar, and potentially frightening initial experience of a young woman's life unfolds within a dwelling packed with her immediate relatives. The encounter takes place behind partitions composed of simple wood and plaster, with her maternal figure resting a mere 30 feet away and her 14-year-old relative occupying the adjacent bedroom. A gathering of 300 individuals had validated the union earlier that day, offering blessings, sustenance, and half a day of vocal melodies, only to then direct two inexperienced youths, a young woman of 20 and a young man of 22, who had been provided with virtually zero understanding, into an isolated room within a house filled with attentive ears, while simultaneously silencing anyone who might have offered genuine guidance. The collective body validated the vow, yet completely ignored the experiential reality that the vow demanded. I remained awake while the auditory evidence penetrated the wall, completely lacking the linguistic tools to categorize what was occurring, an outcome that was not a failure of the system, but rather the system operating precisely as it was engineered to do. The evidence remains clear: the weeping, the hidden grief, the lack of communication, the reality of my own physical self, and that brief 3-minute interaction that should have been a comprehensive lifelong dialogue, but was instead a barrier with a single directive passed through it. For an extended duration, I viewed this strictly as an isolated narrative belonging to my stepsister, one individual experiencing a single night within a family unit that perhaps simply failed to communicate effectively. I internalized that perspective in isolation, much like she internalized her own distress, unaware that this reality was never confined to a single residence. It required removing myself from that environment, interacting with women who had departed from entirely different settlements, and comparing our collective experiences like identical markings, to realize that the sound through that partition was not an isolated sorrow, but rather a structural consistency. The moment that consistency became apparent was the moment this inquiry shifted away from being exclusively about my relative and forced me to confront a reality I was unready to acknowledge. This structural consistency did not present itself overtly. It accumulated gradually through unexpected dialogues in environments that had no connection to that original autumn wedding night. 3 years after my departure from the community, the indicators began to surface. Upon encountering women at transitional gatherings or within non-Amish fellowships, the topic of their marriages would arise, and a distinct expression would briefly manifest on their countenances, the exact same hesitation I had observed in my stepmother's demeanor at the kitchen counter. I began making subtle inquiries, initially framing them around my own difficulties adapting to the outside world. They would express agreement, a conversational void would present itself, and occasionally a woman would choose to speak into that emptiness. The initial instance of another person outlining her own marital night, not through graphic detail, but through its fundamental structure, characterized by the preceding absence of information and the subsequent lack of discussion, caused a physical reaction of recognition in me. The commonality was rooted in an identical framework, the same complete absence of guidance, the same architecture, and the same resultant weeping. To illustrate this, consider the account of an individual I will refer to as Leah, a name utilized with her explicit endorsement. She originated from a community located in Indiana, hundreds of miles removed from my own upbringing, operating under a separate leadership structure, a distinct district, and an entirely different lineage. Her account differed slightly in timing, as her maternal figure provided instruction the evening prior to the ceremony rather than the morning of the event. Seated on the edge of the mattress, her mother delivered a statement that remained permanently etched in her memory. The assertion that a husband would require something from her, and that she must never decline him. Those 11 words constituted the entirety of her preparation. This individual recounted that she did not shed tears during the encounter. Instead, she mentally detached herself from her physical form, observing the event from a psychological distance, akin to standing in an open area watching a weather system affect a distant structure. As she shared this recollection, her grip on a disposable beverage container was so intense that the top dislodged. Despite the variance in geographic location, maternal figures, and specific wording, the foundational absence of genuine substance was identical. Her account verified what my initial observations suggested. This was not an individual failure on the part of my stepmother or an isolated misfortune for my stepsister, but rather an entire cultural apparatus that had optimized the practice of introducing its daughters to intimacy completely unprepared, while characterizing that lack of knowledge as absolute virtue. The mechanics of this structural framework become clear when you trace its path, as it did not merely neglect to inform, but actively transformed a lack of knowledge into a moral asset. A young woman's complete absence of understanding served as validation of her righteousness, and her absolute ignorance on the night of her marriage was viewed as confirmation of her family's spiritual devotion. The same social structure that withheld all terminology regarding human anatomy simultaneously demanded a standard of modesty so absolute that an individual could reach adulthood without any comprehension of her own physical self. This same framework then situated the initial marital encounter directly inside the parental residence, separated only by minimal partitions, embedded within a customary practice so ancient it felt as unalterable as the seasons, an inherent reality rather than a human construct. When the inevitable weeping occurred through the partitions, as it undoubtedly had for generations, the maternal figures who perceived it maintained total silence because they had received the exact same treatment from their own mothers. This absence of communication served as the vital element holding the entire structural arrangement together. To alter it risked unraveling the entire social fabric. Tracing this continuity backward through my stepmother, her maternal predecessors, and every uncommunicative link in the lineage reveals no singular creator of the practice. The silence possessed no specific author, it merely perpetuated itself through maternal figures who genuinely cared for their offspring, yet remained entirely incapable of articulating the truth. Throughout this examination, I have maintained a methodical approach, presenting elements sequentially and evaluating each component with care to describe the findings accurately. Yet, there is a core aspect of this narrative that I have hesitated to confront directly, a reality that is likely palpable. Thus far, the focus has remained on the experiences of my stepsister, the account of Leah, the legacy of my stepmother, and the overarching design of the social system. I must state clearly that utilizing their narratives was a mechanism to defer examining my own history, because I was equally a product of that exact same structural framework and was sent into marriage with the same complete lack of comprehension. At 21 years of age, I entered into a union with a young man of 22 who was fundamentally decent, yet entirely as uninstructed as I was. On the night our community validated our marriage vows and we retired upstairs, the true meaning of the sound from my stepsister's bedroom 7 years prior finally became clear to me, not through the memory of her distress, but because I was suddenly confronted with my own. I can no longer view that moment detachedly. I am back in that space, beneath a quilt featuring the double wedding ring design in shades of blue and white, crafted through the joint efforts of our mothers over multiple weekends. The illumination is extinguished, the residence is occupied by relatives, and I can perceive his shallow, anxious respiration, the breathing of a young man attempting to fulfill a role he has been told to assume without ever being provided the practical understanding of what that role requires. His hands are unsteady, a reality made clear when he reaches toward me, and the vibration translates through the fabric of my sleeve. In that exact instant, the realization strikes me that he is entirely as unguided as I am, and that whoever withheld understanding from me had disadvantaged him with identical thoroughness. The sensation that emerges within me is not precisely terror, but rather the immense, destabilizing void of two individuals positioned at the boundary of an experience that neither possesses the capacity to visualize. I will decline to detail the events that followed, as certain realities belong properly to bodily experience rather than spoken narrative. What can be shared is that I reached out to grasp his hand, maintained that contact, and openly admitted my complete ignorance regarding what was expected of us. His response stands as the most critical piece of evidence in this entire retrospective. He admitted that he did not know either. Two individuals in an isolated space, confronting the exact same absence of guidance. I offered reassurance to him, a detail that warrants emphasis, the bride providing comfort to the groom because no one had granted either of them the fundamental decency of a straightforward, honest explanation. In the absolute absence of that clarity, we navigated the situation blindly together, and my own tears followed quietly in the aftermath, compressed silently against the hand-stitched bedding in the exact manner my stepsister had managed years before. I understood, far too late yet precisely when necessary, that the weeping heard through the partition was never an indicator of vulnerability. It was the natural reaction of a woman's physical self, encountering an experiential reality that should have been introduced through honest language, but was instead delivered without any communication whatsoever. The necessary framework for understanding arrived 2 years after my departure from that lifestyle, while seated in the office of my initial psychological counselor, an individual experienced in assisting women transitioning out of insular religious environments. She articulated a concept that completely arrested my breathing, noting that I had been denied the right to informed preparation for an intimate encounter that profoundly impacted both my physical body and my self-perception. She explained that this withholding was not a casual omission, but a deliberate cultural methodology, and that the emotional conflict I experienced then, and continued to carry, was the entirely natural reaction to experiencing a physical event without possessing any cognitive framework to process it. Informed preparation, I conceptualized those two words repeatedly, turning them over like a smooth object retrieved from a waterway, recognizing their capacity to reorder every past occurrence. My stepsister's weeping was the entirely natural reaction. Leah's psychological detachment was the entirely natural reaction. My own distress into the hand-stitched bedding was the entirely natural reaction. We were never inherently defective, we were simply kept uninstructed. Furthermore, that lack of instruction was not a matter of casual oversight. It was a systematic practice, a tradition, and a deliberate decision enacted upon our physical selves without our participation. The terminology did not merely identify the action taken against us, it redefined what we were prior to that action, complete, capable, and entirely worthy of a straightforward, truthful dialogue. The social structure had conditioned me to interpret my own bewilderment as a personal deficiency, but the realization of this truth demonstrated that the deficiency belonged entirely to the system. The ultimate conclusion of this investigation yielded a reality I never anticipated encountering. My initial objective was simply to comprehend the distress of my stepsister, believing I was analyzing her specific experience, yet the path led directly back to my own quarters, my own bedding, the unsteady hands of my spouse, and the realization that my inability to comprehend her weeping, originally, was because the social system had elevated my lack of comprehension to a moral requirement. My lack of knowledge was never a form of safety. It was the precise instrument that prevented me from understanding the distress my stepsister was communicating through the partition. What the social order designated as virtue was actually a mechanism to prevent sight, training me to take satisfaction in my own blindness. What remained hidden from my view was a person I cared for deeply, weeping a short distance away, experiencing a need that I had been systematically, intentionally, and generationally conditioned to be entirely incapable of meeting. That is the unlooked-for discovery. Not merely that the structure inflicted damage upon us, but that it engineered us to be the instruments of each other's absolute isolation. I was unequipped to assist her because they had already restricted my cognitive understanding in the exact same manner they were preparing to restrict my physical autonomy, entering into the experience completely uninstructed while designating that absence of light as something sacred. Despite everything, there remains an aspect of this reality that I cannot easily categorize. I felt a genuine affection for that lifestyle, the early light appearing in the kitchen, the melodies that extended so deliberately, the symbolic flora in glass vessels, the sound of carriage wheels on stone, and the capacity of an entire community to transform a domestic space into a sacred sanctuary and revert it back within a single day. My analysis of that environment revealed a pattern of silence engineered to pass through successive generations of women, like a continuous strand through material, connecting each era to the preceding one in a mutual, unnameable state of confusion. Yet, a sense of longing for it persists. I hold the systemic damage in one hand and the beauty of the choral melody in the other, finding no necessity to reject either, because both represent absolute realities. The environment that caused me harm was the exact same environment that supported me, and the maternal figures who were unable to speak the truth nevertheless expressed their affection in every limited manner permitted to them. If you have ever perceived distress through a partition without possessing the vocabulary to define what you were experiencing, this realization belongs to you. If you were provided with an absence of information and told it constituted readiness, this realization belongs to you. If your physical self was conditioned to feel internal conflict before ever understanding its own identity, or if you provided reassurance to another in the dark when you were the one who required support, your experience fits this pattern. If you sought to comprehend the trauma of someone you cared for only to uncover your own unresolved experience underneath it, the conclusion remains identical. There is absolute freedom from blame, and guilt was never yours to carry. You were not compromised by your lack of understanding. You were simply kept in an uninstructed state by individuals who had themselves been kept in that exact same condition. The most courageous action you ever performed was to seek understanding regardless of that barrier. My stepsister wept following her marriage ceremony, an occurrence that required more than a decade for me to fully comprehend. The uninvited insight that this exploration ultimately provided me was the realization that her tears and my own were completely identical, and they never represented a badge of dishonor. They stood as the physical form's solitary, authentic response to a reality that no one possessed the resolution to address openly.